Jennifer Kapman. I am the chair of the New Legacy Committee, and to my right here is Reyes Ortega, the co-chair of the New Legacy Committee. We have an amazing event here for you today entitled American Executions. We're going to look at how race, incarceration, and capital punishment intersect in American society, and we have a fabulous panel of speakers today that are going to provide you with information and thoughts that hopefully have you leave here thinking about this in different and new ways. So today, before we get started, I want to make sure we are aware of emergency exits. You're probably very well aware of the exits in the back where you came through, but also there are 2 exits right here to the side, so make sure you are aware of which one is closest to you in the event we need to evacuate. First, I want to introduce 5 of our panelists. The first panelist is a professor of law at UC Davis, was a California Supreme Court justice from 1981 to 1986, served as vice chairman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights from 1993 to 2004, and has been the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Please welcome the Honorable Cruz Reynoso. Our next panelist is the UC Davis Director of the Chicano Studies Department and the recent author of States of Delinquency, Race and Science in the Making of California's Juvenile Justice System. Please welcome Dr. Miroslava Chavez Garcia. Our next panelist is a criminal defense attorney, specializes in the defense of capital crimes, and is a visiting lecturer at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, Hastings College, and the University of San Francisco School of Law. Please welcome Tim Foley. Our next panelist is an attorney at law, founder of the Prison Law Office, author of A Taxpayer's Guide to the California Death Penalty, a member of the Jesuit Order and priest of the Roman Catholic Church from 1962 to 1992. Please welcome Paul Comiskey. And last but not least, our next panelist is a federal public defender and has argued landmark cases before the United States Supreme Court. Noted for his role as lead counsel in the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski trial, his representation of former state school chief William Honig, and other cases such as Michelle Batgirl Comiskey and his case with Reza Eslamania, thank you, and the Billionaire Boys Club murder. Please welcome Quinn Denver. As you can see, we have an amazing group of people up here, and just like you, I can't wait to hear what they have to say. To give you a little more information about what we're going to be doing today, I'm going to welcome Dr. Reyes Ortega to the microphone.
Thank you again for finding some time to spend with us here today in our amazing panel. My name is Dr. Reyes Ortega, and to tell you the truth, I had this very well-written narrative that I had planned to share with you during my opening remarks. Quite seriously, I spent weeks writing, deleting, editing, and was quite prepared to help set the tone for today's event. I was so ready to set the tone. But then, I met a student in my office. And as I began to address the status of his academic success, I noticed a change of posture, a change of facial expression, a change of tone as he began to describe a recent experience he had while walking home nearby from a day of studying from our campus. He was a Latino student, a Mexican-American, whose backpack was full of books and a very special card that he recently earned that would protect him from harm due to his undocumented status. On his way home, he was stopped by local law enforcement, asked to show identification, asked where he was coming from, asked why he was walking so late, asked where he lived, asked to describe the distance from where he was coming from to where he lived, and finally, he was asked if he was on anything. He was told that he fit the description of a person that someone had phoned in. And when everything was said and done, the officer ended with, "Okay, just go home." Fortunately, the student had the presence of mind to remain calm. When I asked how he felt about this encounter, without hesitation, he said, "Mad." Mad, he continued, because this was not the first time that this had happened. I was simply walking home. Now, the reason this story caused an adjustment to my opening remarks is because it was so eerily similar to another story that had taken place in 1975. This also involved a Mexican-American male who was stopped while he was driving home from the university after a long day of studying. As his car and trunk were searched, the officers found nothing more than a backpack with books about sociology, history, and political science. When the student asked why he was stopped, the officers replied that he looked like a suspect that had burglarized homes in a local neighborhood. He too had the presence of mind to remain calm. This too was not the first time. As you know, today's topic explores the relationship between race, incarceration, and capital punishment. What originally prompted an interest in this topic were the findings of studies that revealed, quote, "The color of a defendant and the victim's skin plays a crucial and unacceptable role in deciding who receives the death penalty in America." Also, researchers from the University of North Carolina released a study that found the odds of getting the death sentence increased 3.5 times if the victim was white rather than black. And finally, a Supreme Court evaluation of racial bias in the criminal justice system revealed that race plays a decisive role in the question of who lives and who dies by execution in this country. So these beg the following questions. To what extent do our social institutions influence the introduction of persons of color to our criminal justice system and to the ultimate fate of death row? What responsibility do we have in minimizing the essence of our biases as we determine the fate of those who have been accused? Does the race of jurors impact jury deliberations? How do our valued law enforcement officers perform its critical role to protect and to serve and address a pattern of claims from people who are stopped because they are driving while black, or walking while brown, or Native American? By the way, that student who was driving home after studying all day at the university was me. So to help us understand the complexity of these issues, I am honored to introduce our moderator, recipient to the 2011 Judge of the Year by the Sacramento County Bar Association, who served with the California Department of Justice and also served as Deputy Attorney General and Special Assistant Attorney General. Please join me as I welcome our California Superior Court Judge, the Honorable David de Alba. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ortega, and thank you to Sierra College for having us here this afternoon. Thank you to President Willie Duncan and to the New Legacy Committee for your sponsorship. I'm honored to serve as your moderator and be amongst these distinguished panelists this afternoon. The goal, as you've been told, is to have a conversation about these various issues that have been described. So we'll talk, that is, the panelists will address various questions, issues surrounding race, death penalty, and crime in our society for about an hour. And then thereafter, I would invite any of you to direct a specific question to any of the panelists at about 1:30 or so when we finish the conversation. Most of the discussion will focus on the death penalty here in our state and in the United States, and I hope that all of you will gain some insight into the complexity and the issues surrounding the death penalty and race and the justice system in our state and our country by this presentation. But first, I think maybe a little background about the history of the death penalty in our state, let's say over the last 30 years or so. I know Mr. Foley is an expert. He's a lawyer who has specialized in that area, as you've heard, from bottom up. That is, from trials all the way to the appeals to the highest court. So Tim, if you would, maybe a few comments just generally about the history of the death penalty in the state of California.
In 1972, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty as then imposed in the United States was unconstitutional in a case called Furman versus Georgia. California, like other states, then, if they wanted to retain the death penalty, had to basically draft new statutes. And after a period of, I'll go ahead and call it confusion as to what would be constitutional and what would not be constitutional, California implemented a new capital sentencing procedure in the 70s. Since then, we have, as a state, convicted and sentenced at the beginning roughly 30 to 50 people per year and put them on death row. The cases took a long time to work through the system, and we began executing again with Robert Alton Harris. I believe that was 1986. I'm sorry, 1992. Thanks, Paul. We now have the most populated death row in the nation, but executions have not occurred since 2006. California executed 13 people between 92 and 2006. But we continue to prosecute capital cases at the trial level, and we continue to put people on death row. And at this point, our statute has been amended a number of times, so we have a fairly broad statute. You need to commit a first-degree murder, and you need to have a special circumstance to be capitally sentenced in California. The last thing I would add before kicking it back to the moderator is that the cases are spread through the system. It takes a great deal of time these days to get a case to the California Supreme Court from the trial level, and there are a number of cases in federal district court and federal circuit court that are moving slowly through the system. But I think most people would agree that the system is functioning at a very slow rate, and some people would say that the system in California is basically dysfunctional.
Well, and Quinn, I was going to ask you about the current state of affairs with respect to the process. Why do we have so many people on death row? Why do they wait so long? A little bit of the sense about the current situation of the death penalty. And then, Justice Reynoso, I'm going to ask you after Quinn Denver makes his observation about your experience as a Supreme Court justice with these types of cases. Quinn?
Excuse me. Well, this idea of reforming the law in 1977 and then by initiative in 1978 was that you would only have death penalty eligibility if it was a first-degree murder with a special circumstance. That's the phrase that was used. It was supposed to be a narrowing thing that would single out the most egregious murders for possible death sentences. What happened, though, is that the proposition that came in and supplanted a bill passed by the legislature spread those out very far, the special circumstances. And since then, the legislature has continually added more and more to that, so that now it's the rare first-degree murder that doesn't have a special circumstance available, and therefore the potential of being charged as a death case or a life without possibility of parole case. And what's happened is, since we have this broad net, for a long time, the prosecutors were making great use of it and seeking the death penalty in many cases. They didn't get the death penalty in most of those cases, but the net effect was, given the size of our state, is that we kept building up on death row. So we now have over 750 people there, and also a special one for women. What happened then is that when someone's convicted of the death penalty, they get an automatic appeal to the California Supreme Court, not to the Court of Appeal, the intermediate court, to the top court, which Justice Reynoso sat on. And that court then has to appoint someone to handle that automatic appeal. And then there's another proceeding, a petition for writ of habeas corpus, which goes along with it. And what's happened over time is, with this huge influence, this influx of people on death row, they've had a hard time getting lawyers. There aren't enough lawyers around to handle the appeals and then the habeas. And so many of these cases, just a man or woman would be up on death row for 4, 5, 7 years and not have a lawyer, just sitting and waiting for a lawyer. And then once these cases were brought out and lawyers appointed, there was a lot of briefing involved, there's a lot of investigation for the habeas, and the net effect is it expands the amount of time that any individual case takes, and then there's all these other cases. The California Supreme Court has many other areas in which they sit in both civil and criminal besides the capital, and they don't want to just do nothing but death penalty cases. So the net effect is that has slowed down what happens at the state level, and then these cases, because they involve federal constitutional issues, then can go over into, and do go into, federal court, where again there is a review of the constitutional issues with an appeal to the Ninth Circuit, United States Court of Appeals, and even to the Supreme Court. So the net effect of it has been that there's been a long delay in many of the cases while they were being processed to make sure that they were in fact cases that the death penalty was warranted. And the California Supreme Court, at least recently, has affirmed many of these death cases, and they've gone into federal court, and then they've been either reversed totally, conviction of guilt and sentence, or even more often, just the sentence itself, and they're sent back again. So that's kind of the overview of where it is.
Quinn, how many of these folks on death row today, of the 750 or so, even have a lawyer? And whose responsibility is it in our system to fund or pay for the lawyer?
Well, the responsibility is if a person cannot hire their own lawyer, and no one can in a capital case because the number of hours it takes and everything, that means that the court has to appoint them, and the court has to find lawyers who are willing to work in this very specialized area. It's a specialized area of criminal law, a lot of Eighth Amendment issues, constitutional issues. And I think now, and Tim may have it right, I think there's probably about 130 people on death row who don't have an appeals lawyer, and probably at least twice or three times as many people who do not have a habeas lawyer. The habeas, just so you understand, the appeal is based exactly on what happened in court. The habeas is based on such things as ineffective assistance of counsel, jury misconduct, things that aren't in court and they have to be investigated and then brought into court for the court to look at.
Justice Reynoso, you heard undoubtedly dozens of death penalty cases in your tenure in the Supreme Court. What was your experience as a justice with some of the things that we've talked about, delays, the size of the record, the issues, et cetera?
Yeah, first of all, I should say that you get an education on...
Let's see, I don't know if your mic is on or if you need to lower.
Can you hear me all right?
There you go.
Okay. I started to say that you get an education on the ability of one human being to do terrible things to other human beings. Some of those records are tremendously bothersome, just speaking as a human being. But then you get into it. And when there's an appeal to the Supreme Court, it's not just as to whether or not the death penalty was the appropriate remedy in that case, legal remedy. The lawyers have a duty to appeal any issue that they have seen that's appealable, where they think maybe a mistake was made by the jury or by the judge, etc. So invariably the briefs come very, very long with many, many issues, all of which we have to decide, as well as the issue of the death penalty. So it takes a great deal of time. There are 7 justices on the Supreme Court, and normally it's assigned to one judge. The judge will then write at that time, now I understand it's a little bit different, but at that time we would write an extensive memo on the case before having a hearing. Then we would have the hearing, and then the Chief Justice would assign a person to write the opinion. I wrote several such opinions during the time that I was on the court. Very often, for constitutional or other reasons, for example, there had been some changes in the law, and cases came to us where the judge had given the wrong instructions. There was no question the person was guilty, but a jury has to function under the proper instructions. So we essentially had to overturn those cases to have a portion of it tried again. And normally when we reviewed it, it's only the death penalty. You have two different like trials. One is, did he do it, and two, should he have the death penalty imposed? When we reversed, we would only reverse the second part. So the person was going to continue being in prison. I say that because so often folk thought that when we reversed a case, the person was out free. In fact, nobody, when I was on the court, was out free when we reversed the case, because we were only reversing a portion of it or sending it back to be tried anew. So it was long and difficult to decide those cases. And then, sad to say, I must say there was one case that came before me where I thought there were no instructional errors, where I thought everything had been done properly. And so I wrote an opinion affirming the death penalty, and the majority of the justices on the court agreed with me. I had real qualms about it, I should tell you. It had to do with a young man who had allegedly disarmed and shot to death 2 highway patrolmen. How one young man who was not armed would have had the power to do that, it seemed odd to me, let's put it that way. Nonetheless, there was a witness, his girlfriend, who said, yes, he did it, and this is how he did it. So it seemed to me that it was up to the jury to make that decision. So as I say, we affirmed it. I should tell you that just recently, maybe last year, I noticed that one of those innocence projects had taken over his case. It's one of those projects that are in several universities where students go out and investigate and see whether or not the person, in fact, is innocent. And they've had, sad to say, great success in finding many people who were found guilty that, in fact, were innocent. I don't know what's going to happen in that case, but I know that even though I thought everything was done right, and the court affirmed the death penalty, I confess I had some qualms about it. So that was sort of my dual reaction. One, the terrible actions that happen sometimes by folk clearly who have no sensitivity to the suffering of others. But two, at least in that one case, even though everything was done right, having some qualms about it. And then, of course, we've already talked about the other issues that come up and why there have been delays. But those were my personal experiences.
I want to ask Tim, how is the decision made? Who decides that some individual who's committed murder should suffer the death penalty as opposed to life without possibility of parole? Who actually makes the decision to begin with? And then, Paul, I'm going to ask you about moral and maybe ethical issues related to those decisions. Paul, Tim?
Well, there's 58 counties in California, so the sitting district attorney would make the decision in an individual case whether to pursue the death penalty. Because of the breadth of the statute that Quinn was talking about earlier, there are more first-degree murder special circumstance cases than could be prosecuted as death cases. So at some point, a elected district attorney makes a decision which individual cases to pursue. And let me note that some counties have a sort of formal process set up for that, such as Los Angeles counties, where they see a lot of cases. Some counties seem to have no process whatsoever. The district attorney just makes the decision.
And Paul, what's your experience or what's your view about those decisions? You are unique in that, as I read your background, you were a member of the Jesuit order and was actually a priest for some 30 years before you went to law school. And no doubt you've thought long and hard about these moral, kind of ethical issues surrounding the death penalty. How do you view all this?
Well, I was in the Jesuits for 10 years, and then the Jesuit order sent me to law school. I wanted to work with prisoners. I set up the prison law office outside the gates of San Quentin. One of the things that I noticed immediately was that you would think, by what I saw in San Quentin, that the population of California was 36% black, 45% Latino, and about 17% white. The entire criminal justice system in California, like in other states in our country, is very, very racist, and it can't help it. And the United States Supreme Court in McCleskey versus Kemp basically said, yep, things are racist. They had very, very strong proof in Georgia with a very, very detailed study that the most important determinant of who gets the death penalty is who is the victim. And that if you kill a black person and you kill a white person, you're 4 or 5 times more likely to get the death penalty for killing the white person. It's racist that the death penalty has been used from the beginning of our country to suppress black people. When Paul Revere took his ride, he rode past a black man who was hanging in a gibbet, which was a kind of a cage they used to hang him up so he'd stay hanging up longer. They wanted to put him on display. When the Jim Crow era was happening in our country between 1890 and 1930, there were more black people lynched than there were executed. And now on our California death row, we have the same kind of disproportion of black and brown people on the death row as we do in the rest of the prison population. And the prison population is growing every day because of the war on drugs, which specifically targets black and brown people. And if, as a result of the war on drugs, which happened between 1982 and 2005, there were 4 times as many white people in prison after the war on drugs, but there were 21 times as many Latino people and 22 times as many black people, or rather 26 times as many black people in our prisons. So we are disabling people, we're just feeding people into the death row. My view of the death penalty is that if it were applied equally to people, we wouldn't have it anymore. But it's not applied equally. It's applied to black and brown people in great disproportion. And it's easy for people to say, well, we can just ignore that, or they deserve it, or those are the criminals. So I think that the death penalty was racist when it began in this country. It has been used from the day it was established to keep certain populations in check. Even in the era of lynchings, the hangings that were done by the sheriff. If it were done legally in some cases, they would publicize it for miles, and they'd hang people outside the courthouses. They did that in California too. So my view of the death penalty is that it is an affront to any civilized people. It ought to be abolished. We tried to abolish it last election with Proposition 36. Unfortunately, we lost by 48 to 52%, but we'll be back.
Paul, and I appreciate your comments about race and incarceration, and we're going to get some more comments from Dr. Chavez Garcia about that, and I want to ask Quinn about the Supreme Court's view about the disparate impact surrounding the death penalty. But my question to you is someone who has been a man of faith, how do you see the moral issues surrounding the death penalty? What do you say to someone who lost a close family member to a brutal crime? What about the issue of retribution? Paul?
Retribution is another word for revenge. And if you want revenge, it's not going to satisfy you. If you're looking for revenge, it's like drinking a glass of poison every day. It's going to poison you. And I feel sorry for these people in our society who are victims of crime. There was a lady down in Sacramento, and I went and watched the death penalty trial of the guy who killed her and who sodomized and killed her 8-year-old son in Sutter County. And she's waiting and waiting and waiting for the revenge. She's thinking she's going to feel better after that guy gets killed. Well, right now, those people are waiting 30-plus years. The people on death row, if we start executing people on death row again, they will have been there for 33 or 34 years. By that time, a lot of those family members have died. So as a person of faith and as a Christian and just as a person who's concerned about somebody's mental health, I would say you have to come to forgiveness. And when you forgive, it's not something you're doing for that other person. It's something you're doing for yourself. That's what you need to do.
Thank you, sir. Quinn, Paul raises a lot of issues about the number of minorities, blacks, Hispanics, others that are incarcerated, especially on death row, the disproportionate number of folks that are on death row throughout the United States. Haven't lawyers raised this argument with the United States Supreme Court and argued that in states like Texas, Florida, California, elsewhere, that the death penalty is fundamentally unfair because it impacts minorities, blacks, Hispanics disproportionately?
They have, but I want to say one thing. Paul's right that the people on death row, and actually in the whole California prison system, are black, brown, and Asian, and poor. There's nobody on death row that I can think of that has ever had any money. Most of them were represented by court-appointed public defenders or counsel, and people who have enough money usually can find a way not to end up on death row. But there was a case that was brought in Georgia where they did some statistical studies that showed absolutely clearly that if you were, they were focusing there on black, you had a much greater chance of getting the death penalty. And if you happened to kill a white person, then you would get even more chance of getting the death penalty. And what the Supreme Court said, they kind of acknowledged that, but they said that may all be true, but what you have to do is you have to show in your individual case that it was racially affected. And that just made it almost impossible because part of it is society, part of it's people's unconscious, part of it's done behind closed doors. There's all these things that lead to this racial imbalance. And the idea that you, in a particular case, you'll be able to show that this district attorney picked the death penalty because of the race, or that jurors voted death penalty because of the race, it's just impossible. So they acknowledged the problem and then said, they threw their hands up and said, well, we can't deal with
Quinn,
it.
didn't they actually say that you had to show intent? That it was the intention to discriminate against
Correct.
that person in death penalty?
In that case.
Right, and how can you show intent?
Well, if someone said,
Yeah.
the only reason I did this is because he was black, I
Right,
guess
and we've learned not to say those things. Yeah.
Justice Brennan, in dissenting into that case, he said, my colleagues are a little too afraid of justice. They knew that our whole entire criminal justice system is racist, and if they had agreed with McCleskey, they would open up the whole door to endless challenges.
This whole question of the disproportionate number of minorities that are locked up as adults on death row really starts early. That is, there's a large school of thought that criminality, or those that end up committing the most heinous crimes, entered the justice system young. Professor Chavez Garcia, I know you have read a lot and you've written a lot and discussed a lot and studied the empirical data about what it is that might lead to, or why it is juveniles may or may not enter the criminal justice system. Do you have
And
a
she's
comment?
written a lot, too.
Thank you.
Because that's where it starts, so
Yes,
to speak.
right. Right, in my own work, I do take a historical approach in looking at these issues, particularly as they pertain to juveniles, to youth. But certainly what I found in doing more, looking at more contemporary issues is how much there's a holdover from what you see happening in the early 20th century. So my research looked at a history of reform schools of juvenile corrections in early 20th century California, looking at the experiences of Mexican, black, and white ethnic boys who ended up at one of the principal state reformatories. And so what I found was that in by, I want to say, the 1910s, 1920s, that Mexican boys are overrepresented in this one institution, as are blacks increasingly as they migrate to the state. And the conditions that sort of lead them there, sort of some of the, people talk about these risk factors or these issues that they confront are very similar. When I look at cases today, are very similar to what was happening in the early 20th century, in terms of what's going on in their homes, in their communities, schooling, issues of language, representation, all these other things that are hard to pinpoint, but that are happening, that are leading to a particular segment of youth of color in particular to end up being detained for whatever reason, So it's those decisions that are made by, police officers or, officials in the schools that you can't put your finger on, but that are happening. And why are certain youth being picked up while others who are committing the same crimes or doing the same kinds of transgressions, if we want to call them crimes, are not being picked up, right? Who's there to intervene on their behalf? And so I think that's what happens today. My students have been writing papers about today about juveniles in the system, and so this disproportionate minority contact or confinement, as it's called. And there's a whole array of issues that are still so similar to 100 years ago, still happening.
Professor, from my chair as judge over in Sacramento County, regrettably, I see many young Latino, Black, Asian kids affiliated with gangs and caught up in the circle of violence through gangs. Can you make a comment from your studies about the gang culture and why is it and what's happening and what can we do to prevent that, perhaps? It seems it's a gateway, obviously, to criminality.
And, yes, in many ways. I'm not a gang expert per se. It's not my complete area of research. It is something I read about and I look at what other scholars have said. James Diego Vigil, I would say he's one of the leading experts in terms of Chicano Latino gangs and also he's done some really great work in looking at sort of the comparative work with Vietnamese, Salvadoreños, and African Americans as well, is he looks at what he calls it street socialization, as that being sort of a commonality to all of these, the involvement of young men and women in gangs, and that is in which the conditions lead these young people to have to seek education or socialization being raised on the streets because there's no other viable alternatives. The schools are not working for them. Their home life may have disruptions that also don't work for them. And so there's only one place to go, right? And that's the streets. And that's where they learn. And so that's where it begins. Their peers become very influential. The ways to make ends meet become very influential, which are taking place in the street. So the street becomes this place in which they find a means of survival. And what's interesting, I think, is that we tend to think of gangs as being sort of pervasive and they're everywhere. And it's actually a very small percentage. I think Professor Vigil, who's at UC Irvine, says like about 8% of Latino. I mean, it's a very small number, yet we tend to conflate that or inflate that to make it seem like, if somebody's wearing, baggy pants and the white T-shirt, they're a member of
well, whatever
gang.
that number is, it's far too large. Some of the, as a judge, the most tragic things I see are gang members, black or brown, shooting and killing each other. And it's just horrific. Justice Reynoso, you had a comment?
Yeah, Judge, yes. I guess we need to be reminded that in the 1920s, practically all of the gangs were headed up by Jews and by Italians. Why? It happened because Jews and Italians were very much discriminated against at that time. And I think maybe that tells us a little bit of why we end up having a limited number, but a substantial number nonetheless, of Latino and Black kids being in gangs. It's not accidental.
Justice Reynoso, another sad statistic, state of affairs, is youth in academia. I mean, if you look just in this auditorium, or I'm sure as the Legacy Committee knows, the enrollment of minorities, Black, Hispanics, Asians, and others in higher education is disproportionate to those that are locked up. The number of resources and dollars that are spent in incarcerating young people is disproportionate, it seems,
Yes.
to education. Can you comment?
Yeah, very much so, because I'm an educator. When I was a youngster, and I've been around for a few years, California had the reputation for having the best public schools in the country. Now this is K through 12. Now we're very, very near the bottom. California had the best higher institutions in the country. When I attended a community college, I paid zero for the education. I bought my own books and all that, but we paid nothing for the education part of it. When I went to law school, again, another public school in Berkeley, I paid less than $100 a year for my education. Now those same students are expending or being charged over $50,000 in fees. So it seems to me, Mr. Chair, that we as a citizen group in California are really failing our public institutions. Indeed, Governor Schwarzenegger appointed a commission to look at the fact that we're only producing, all of the higher institutions of higher education are only producing 10,000 engineers a year, and industry in California needs 20,000, twice as many. And I knew the chair of that committee. I saw him before and after he saw the governor, and afterwards I said, how'd the governor respond to your committee's recommendations? He said, he loved all our recommendations, but at the end he says, isn't it too bad we have no money? So we apparently aren't willing to put in the resources that we need even for our own future welfare. So that's something that we as citizens, I think, really have to worry about.
Before I came here, I noted that last year the state of California spent approximately $180 million on death penalty expenses. Mr. Comiskey, you had a comment?
Yes, I have a comment. Aristotle said that a person who just goes along like the weather, sees what the weather is but doesn't do anything about it, is an idiote. That's Greek. That means an idiot. And so while I'm here with you students, I'd like you to not be idiots, but make some connections. One of the connections that Judge Reynoso just talked about, when I went to Davis between 72 and 75, I paid $1,500 a year. I went there recently, $45,000 a year now is what it cost. Well, because we're using our money for prisons. When I opened the prison law office, we had 25,000 prisoners in 1975. Now we have 177,000. We've got people locked up for so long that it's ridiculous. We got so many people locked up who are going to spend their lives in prison, and if you're in prison, you have a constitutional right to medical care. So they're taking prisoners out for lung transplants, heart transplants, things like that that cost millions of dollars. Now, Jerry Brown has heard from you students who go up there and lobby him about the fact that you can't get your classes, you can't graduate in 4 years, you can't afford it, and he would love to do something for you, but he's spending all the money on prisons. And the prisons have gotten so bad that they're under two different federal courts, which that has cost millions and billions of dollars. And if you just read the newspapers from the last week or so, he's whining about the federal judges taking over the prison and all the billions of dollars it's costing him. But it's because we built all those prisons. When Duke Majan, Pete Wilson, and Gray Davis were running for governor, they all started out there at Folsom Prison on Labor Day, and they all got $1 million from the prison guards to start their campaign. And the prison guards want something for their money, and what they wanted was they want good pay and they want more prisons built. So we built 21 more prisons. We went up to 177,000. We are far over incarcerating people. 2/3 of them are locked up for drug violations or petty theft, what you call non-serious crimes. And as a result, we're bankrupting our colleges and our universities. We're going to pay for it.
Well, let me correct a little bit. 2/3 of them, Paul, have abusive histories. They're not locked up for drugs per se and petty crimes, but they have abusive alcohol and or drug in their background. Tim, do we execute juveniles, women, or people who are what we'll call incompetent in the United States?
Pursuant to United States Supreme Court precedent of a couple years ago, we no longer have the death penalty for juveniles in the United States. And indeed, pursuant to a a case that came out a couple years ago, we also don't have life without parole for a non-homicide offense by juveniles. So the United States Supreme Court has set a floor there. You have to be at least 18 when you commit your crime to be eligible for the death penalty. In terms of women, they're eligible the same as men. The raw numbers are that probably less than 5% of death row is women. That probably corresponds to the fact that most homicides are committed by men. And then in terms of competence, there is a doctrine that if you're incompetent, if you're insane, you cannot be executed. That if you are, and that causes a great deal of stress in the system, because when somebody's on death row for 20 or 25 years, it's not surprising to see them, particularly in light of the fact that they probably started out with some issues, but after 25 years on death row, a lot of people develop florid mental illness. And by the time the state comes around to execute them, there is an immense amount of litigation regarding their competency.
So if I understood you correctly, if you're insane or incompetent at the time you commit your offense, that clearly is an issue that might prohibit the imposition of the death penalty. But if you're competent and then become insane, what happens? Or what's the situation today?
You cannot be executed if you're presently incompetent, even if you were competent at the time of your crime and were properly convicted. Now, what's interesting about that is there's a lot of litigation around the question of involuntary medication, because there's some people on death row who have to be medicated to be competent. So you can imagine that's a bit of an ethical issue for the doctors. Do you give these guys the drugs to make them competent so the state can go out and execute them?
All right, and speaking of drugs and execution, Quinn, I know a lot of the debate right now surrounds unusual and cruel and unusual punishment with respect to the lethal injection. Can you speak to that debate?
I can. The cruel and unusual clause of the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution has been the basis for many of these rulings, the ones that say that you can't execute someone who's a juvenile, you can't execute people for non-murder cases, and various limitations. When the whole system was thrown out in '72 and they brought it back in '77, that again was all under the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual. And the Supreme Court has failed to hold that the death penalty itself, in itself, is cruel and unusual punishment. A number of individual justices have said that, some of them in dissents, and some of them after they left the court, but the court has never done that. On the other hand, there's been an evolution in looking at the method of execution to determine whether that is cruel and unusual. And so you have a history of California started out with hanging people, and then people felt that was really it was a cruel way of killing someone because it was so painful and it was prolonged. Then they switched over to electric chair. Again, there were problems with that. They would try to electrocute people, and they were unable to, and the person strapped in. They have to try it again later. They later went to the gas chamber and found out that was a very ineffective way because, again, someone would just have this lingering death, and the idea was, well, why are we doing that? And so now we've come to what they call the lethal injection, the idea that they inject the chemicals into you that will kill you. In California right now, they use what they call a cocktail of chemicals, and one of them is supposed to knock you out, one of them does something else, and one of them stops your heart. And there's been a lot of litigation in federal court, and that's why we haven't had an execution since 2006, where a federal judge has basically said that is cruel and unusual because people, again, are sitting there suffering, waiting to die after they've been injected. Now, some states have solved that by going to a single, immediately acting injection. But the thing that's kind of interesting about this is there's a whole history of ways that people are executed, and one of them in the gospel this last Sunday, and this is very interesting. You always hear quoted an eye for an eye. People say that's the reason we have the death penalty. But of course, we don't do that generally. We don't say that if someone someone hits someone, we hit them back. We say if someone shoots them, you shoot them back. We don't. That isn't the way our criminal justice system works, and in fact, that's not the biblical basis for that. Doesn't make any sense, because in this gospel the last Sunday, there's a woman who committed adultery, and the Old Testament said a person who did that should be stoned to death, and that's when Christ basically said that he who's without sin cast the first stone, and of course everybody gave that up and it disappeared. But stoning used to be the way that people were killed. They would be put down in a hole, and people just throw rocks at them. I was reading over in Saudi Arabia, they behead people. They've beheaded people, 75 people a year, for all sorts of crimes, not homicides. And their problem is that the executioners, the swordsmen, are so busy traveling around that they have to find a new way to do it, so they've decided they could be able to do it by a firing squad. So there's always been this history. We say we want to kill someone, and then when we look at the way we're doing it, we're like, well, it's one thing just to exterminate a person's life, but should you torture them while you're doing it? And that's something that's different. But I want to say one other thing too, is that the whole idea of retribution just doesn't really make sense. I mean, it does. The reasons they justify the death penalty is it will deter this person from committing a crime again. Well, by putting people in these supermax prisons for life without parole, you've pretty well taken that. The other idea is that it will deter other people from committing murders. And all the studies show that is just not true, that murderers do not weigh the crime and say, you know, I'd kill my wife. I was only going to get life without parole, but I could get death. I won't do it. It's the nature of these crimes aren't that. And maybe a white-collar criminal would do that. And then the third one is retribution. And as Paul says, in the end, people never get closure on these cases, and they don't really feel that much better when the person is executed. And you have to understand that, as Justice Reynoso says, these are horrible crimes. But our basic idea of humans is that nobody is the worst thing they did. We've all done things that are wrong, and you say, well, that's not me alone. I mean, there's other things. And the idea on this is, when someone's been convicted of one of these horrible crimes, the only question is, will they die in prison when God determines it, or will they be executed by the state? And so there's retribution and revenge in all these cases, in the sense that there's punishment for what they've done.
Quinn, what is the answer to the average citizen who says, I just left the veterinarian and put my pet down with an injection, and it seemed to be humane, so why can't the state do the same? What's the argument?
Well, the state has decided to use this 3-drug cocktail, which, as they say, it renders somebody immobile, and then a next state, and then they finally die. And I don't know what they use for dogs and cats, but I think that's what's been holding it up. Is that there's got to be a better way to do it. But the basic problem is we shouldn't have a death penalty, not how we carry it out. I mean, whether it's guillotine or anything else.
Tim, do you have a comment?
Yeah, one of the problems was that when they went from the gas chamber to lethal injection, it was just simply the logistics and clumsiness of the way that San Quentin converted the chamber. I mean, they took this vacuum-sealed gas chamber and turned it into a lethal injection chamber, and there were IV lines that went up. The people who were supposed to administer it were in darkness and couldn't see what they were doing, and when they were able to investigate that after a couple of botched executions, they discovered that the entire system was a mess. That's when the original stay came down from Judge Fogel. And since then, San Quentin has built a new chamber, and there are some problems with that, but that's essentially the heart of the litigation, and now it's being sat upon by Judge Seaborg.
Do you have a follow-up, Paul?
The first drug is supposed to make the person unconscious. The second drug paralyzes the person so they can't move, so they're not flopping around on the gurney upsetting the witnesses. The third drug attacks the heart and stops the heart. The problem that they have is that no anesthesiologist is permitted by their ethics to participate in this process, so they have prison guards who become the death team, and they're trained to do it. When they were in that very dark chamber, they really couldn't see whether the first drug did in fact render that person unconscious. And if it did not, if they didn't give that person enough drug or they didn't hit the vein or whatever, then that person was going to be suffering a terrible, terrible suffering. And the standard is you cannot use any more suffering than is necessary to cause death. That's what the U.S. Supreme Court says, and that's why they had a problem with it. So in order to use this process, the Department of Corrections they spent millions of dollars, or not that much, $850,000 redoing their death chamber, and then they went through a whole rulemaking process. And this whole process, they've used about 5 or 6 years without executing anybody, just with a big fight over how to administer the drug to kill somebody.
And let me just, a little further on that, what that basically means is lethal injection is a constitutional way of executing somebody. But California's lethal injection delivery system is essentially broken, and a judge is determining now whether or not it can be reinstituted. But presumably, if California continues to have the death penalty and they work out the problems, California can begin to commence executions.
How are people being executed in Texas, Florida, Georgia, where we have these high rates? By injection?
By lethal injection primarily.
Yeah.
And there's a new procedure with a one drug that was, I think, Ohio? Yeah, Ohio started.
Could I ask a question? So there's no medical personnel, no doctor? I thought there was when that's being administered, or no?
Well, one of the problems was the training was bad, but there are supposedly trained people, but not a doctor because it's against their ethics.
I have one or two more questions I want to ask the panelists before we invite any of you to ask a question. And Justice Reynoso, with respect to the rest of the world, international law, executions in other places in the world, where does the United States stand?
Well, the United States is one of the few industrialized countries that actually still has the death penalty. Most of the industrialized countries have done away with the death penalty really some years ago. It's a little bit like slavery. By the time we had the Civil War, most of the world had done away legally with slavery. I say legally because sometimes, even though it's unlawful, you still find it in places. So it's true of the death penalty. We just heard about Egypt. It's true in China still, I believe. But in most countries that look like us in terms of being industrialized countries did away with it a long time ago.
Quinn, did you have a follow-up or thought on that?
No, I was going to say the countries that still have the death penalty and use it quite a bit are not exactly ones we would want to model ourselves after. I mean, that's Iran, Saudi Arabia, China. Some of the worst countries are the ones that use the death penalty very effectively.
Paul, did you have a comment on that subject?
Most of the civilized world has given up the death penalty. Russia has, all of the European nations, all of the Latin American nations. They simply cannot understand why we continue with such a barbaric practice when we try to hold ourselves out to the rest of the world as this great beacon of human rights.
Well, I know that we have examined the question in California in our recent past election, and as Paul said earlier, the vote was very close. And I know that some conservative commentators like Bill O'Reilly and even the authors of the original death penalty, Senator Briggs and his family, have even re-examined their views on the death penalty. But before we open it up for questions, Justice Reynoso, I wanted to just ask you to make a comment. We've talked just briefly about social justice issues, about the incarceration of youth. We haven't talked much about driving while black, driving while brown, the disproportionate impact of the death penalty on minorities in general. What would, if Cesar Chavez, who I know you knew, was alive, and he was on this panel, and we threw sort of a general question to him about how do you see this in California? How do you see the state of affairs of this criminal justice system that we finance and its impact on minorities?
Yes, I worked with Cesar Chavez in a group called the CSO, Community Service Organization, before he started organizing farm workers, then worked with him, of course, when he was organizing farm workers. And he felt very, very strongly that a society ought to be responsive to its citizens believed very strongly in citizen participation. Much of what we did was helping folk become citizens, helping folk register, helping folk vote, and so on. For example, in the CSO, we had the legislature authorize a pension for older people because at that time, farm workers and many others were not covered by Social Security. And he believed and he would say himself that he first began his social activity studying Mahatma Gandhi, which, as you know, did not believe in retribution, did not believe in actually in violence. So he would have been very much against, and he was very much against the death penalty, believed that we should do everything we can as human beings to help one another be a better human being.
Thank you, and I know he was a big student of St. Francis of Assisi as well with respect to nonviolence. Well, I think our time is up for the panel. I wish we had more time. I know these people have many more observations and thoughts and conversation, but we felt before we came out here that one of the best parts of this presentation would be to give you a chance to ask any question that you wanted to direct to any of us. So there are microphones here in the front of the stage, and you're welcome to come on down if you so please and make a question. And if you'd like to be next, just come on down to the next microphone. Yes, sir, to my right.
Hi, my name's Jay Hester, and the question I had is, I understand incarceration, maybe Dr. Chavez Garcia, this would be best for you, has always been sort of disproportionately focused on ethnic minorities. With the passage of 3 strikes, have we seen an impact of that on that sort of connection between the 3 strikes law and the makeup of incarceration from a race standpoint?
Well, I don't know if Dr. Chavez Garcia has studied that, but I can tell you that in the state of California, there's no question that, like the death penalty, the 3rd strike law, 3 strikes law has had, again, some will say disproportionate, but statistically higher impact on minority communities. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to offer a comment.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just want to say that one of the things that's happened is that under the laws, we've taken a lot of discretion away from judges, and certainly Judge Yalba could speak to that, where the legislature said, if you commit this crime, you've got to send to prison for this many years. You don't have any options. And that type of discretion then lies with the district attorneys on what they will ask for, and it's really up to the district attorneys to decide whether or not they're going to charge the 3 strike law. It doesn't happen automatically, so it's completely up to district attorneys, so you can expect exactly the same results with 3 strikes that we see with the other prosecution of crimes. Thus, for example, with respect to drug crimes, the statistics show that each ethnic and racial group uses drugs, illegal drugs, at about the same rate. Yet nonetheless, as indicated before, 60, 70, 80, 90% of those who are sent to prison for drug-related crimes are black or brown. It's not accidental. It has to do with what the district attorneys do. They're the ones that have the discretion, not the judges.
And I will add that we just passed Prop 36, the last election, which allows people who are incarcerated for life on a 3rd strike to petition a judge to be released. And in fact, that is starting to happen throughout California. Quinn, did you have another comment?
Well, I was going to say, there were 2 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court that challenged the 3rd strike being any felony at all. I argued one, Ewing, and the other one was argued by a law school dean. And they were Andrade and Ewing, who was African American. That may tell you something about whether it has a racial impact.
All right, thank you for your question. Paul?
Just
Tim?
quickly, in the same way the United States is out of step with the rest of the world with the death penalty, the mass incarceration movement, which has occurred in this country, you dated it from 82, I think maybe 73, to the present time is completely out of step. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, 4 times that of Mexico, 10 times that of Canada, multiple times other nations, and it's absolutely clear that whether it's the 3 strikes, the war on drugs, the recidivist sentencing, whatever it is, it's had a disproportionate effect on people of color.
All right, and
The
our
only
next
thing
question.
that I'd add
Oh, I'm
is that
sorry.
California has the third largest prison system in the world. The largest is in China, where they have how many billions of people? They lock up about 1 billion people. The second is the United States federal government, and the third is California. So if you're wondering why your tuition is going up and why there's no classrooms for you, that's why.
If you could say your name and then whether you're a student or faculty or whatever it be. Yes, sir.
All right. My name is Surfel. I'm a student at Sierra College. And my question was, when it comes to the death penalty, do you guys think having it is going to save us, like the taxpayers' money, or is it not having it wouldn't make a difference and everything?
Paul, you have a quick thought?
The law professor and a federal judge who, on the Ninth Circuit, who believe in the death penalty, the federal judge does, the law professor does, and they did a study of how much the death penalty cost. So far, we have spent $4.4 billion on the death penalty in California, and we have executed 13 people, so that means we spend $308 million for each person we execute. If we keep on like that, we're going to bankrupt the state trying to execute people. You could put a person for prison in life for about 10% of that. That is the biggest myth in the world, that the death penalty costs less than life without parole. If a person gets on death row, they have a lawyer. It may take them a while to get one, but they have a lawyer for the rest of their life.
Most of the studies seem to suggest the death penalty is more expensive than just locking people up for life without possibility of parole. Was there another panelist who wanted to address that question? I think that's a good question. Thank you, sir. To my right?
Hi, my name is Haley, and I'm a student. I'd like to thank you for being here. My question is actually kind of long, so I had to write it down. Since the beginning of the creation of the courts, race has been a key indicator to the jury when finding the person guilty or innocent. Emmett Till's case is a prime example of this, of the failure of the court system and the race-based discrimination within the system. Justice is meant to be fair and unbiased, and race is not meant to be a factor. We have the right to due process of the law in this just system. In your opinion, what do you believe we can do to change the disproportion of the race in our jails, prisons, and on death penalty, and how have you applied this thinking into your own careers?
Somebody want to tackle that one?
Well,
Justice Reynoso?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, even though, as Judge Chavez said, folk go to prison not just for drug abuse, but they've done some other things. Nonetheless, it seems to me that that drug abuse is really a medical problem rather than a prison problem. So one of the things that we could do is do away with the war on drugs, because that has doubled, at least maybe tripled, the number of prisoners that we have, and that obviously would reduce the disparity, hopefully. But I want to mention to you one harder thing, and that is that some of you may have read that I was the chair of the task force that looked at the pepper spray incident at Davis. And during that time, I met with many experts. One expert told me that he had been hired by nearly 60 police departments to do a study of how they did their work, and that out of all those police departments, only one met the standards he thought all of them should meet. And the standards he had was this: one, obey the law. These are sworn officers now. Obey the law and obey the regulations of the department. Two, and more importantly, that there be an ambiance, an expectation in that police department that if one violates that, those laws or those procedures, that will be brought to the attention of a superior. He said only one had that practice. All the others had what's called the mentality of protecting one another, and so it means that those folk who are sworn to obey the law, if they disobey the law, very often have little fear that they will be caught. And it seems to me that, and I don't have the answer for you on that, but it seems to me that we've got to put pressure on the police chiefs to make sure, or to get as close as they can to having police departments where a police officer will understand that if they violate the law or they don't follow the regulations, it'll be brought to the attention of the police chief. That, to me, is a very serious problem. I was invited by a group associated with the American Bar Association to do a study of why minorities had such a poor opinion of the administration of justice. They thought it had to do with the judges. Once they got into it, they discovered it had to do with the police. That is the first encounter by young people with the administration of justice or the police, and that's where they started getting the negative reactions that they have, and then it gets spilled into the judicial system too. So that it's you've asked a very hard question.
You have asked a hard question, but let me suggest to you it's a political sociological response. In a democracy, how you change those kinds of things that you asked about is an informed and educated citizenry, which then understands governance, which then translates into an informed electorate that participates. And that's generally how you change things in a democracy, at least in my view. Let's hear the next question, because I know there are a lot of people, young people, who have a question. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Robert. I'm a student. I was wondering how, you kind of mentioned it before, but I wanted to know more in detail how you think race affects the prison industrial complex and the use of people of color and especially women in prison labor.
And I bet Paul Comiskey has the answer to that. The prison industrial complex, Paul.
During the period of slavery in the United States in the South, the most valuable economic resource was people, was the slaves. And the slave masters tried to take care of their slaves because that was their resource. That was their way of living. During the Jim Crow era, the black people and the poor people were the ones who did the grunt work. Now, in this day, the black people and brown people are locked up, and they're branded as criminals, and the prison industrial complex gets paid a lot of money for keeping them locked up. And so that's what we're doing. And this is a process that's starting when kids are in school. We talk nowadays about what's called the school to prison pipeline. You put kids in second-rate schools, and then we have a lot of policies that are what they call zero tolerance policies. A kid violates a school rule, they get bounced out of school, they get expelled with no due process or very little, and then that's the beginning of them losing all of their rights. This little book right here is called The Collateral Consequences of a Juvenile Adjudication. It's amazing what we take away from kids right from day one. We take away the right to food stamps, the right to employment, the right to go to the military. We put big restitution things on them, and that whole pattern continues. If they go to prison, they have all those those and many other disabilities. And so we have made an industry out of, unfortunately, locking up a lot of our fellow citizens.
Could I add something to that really quick?
Yes, please, Professor.
This quarter of my students, we read a book by Victor Rios, who's a sociologist at UC Santa Barbara. He wrote a book called Punished, Policing the Lives of Young Black and Latino. So it's set in Oakland, actually, his study. And what he looks at the hypercriminalization of youth, and he says it doesn't just happen with police officers or probation officers, it's parents, or sometimes we threaten our kids by calling the police. It's in the schools right away, or why there's security, officers on your campus. So we're turning over the power that we have over children to the state, is what he's saying. And it's amazing how he shows in this one community, it's almost impossible to go straight. Everything is pushing you to somehow end up on a record, right? So he talks about that process. It's a really, really good book and very detailed. And he himself was a former gang member, actually, Dr. Rios. And he's an amazing scholar and writer.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I don't want to have all of our answers be in the negative. So let me tell you that I've been very encouraged by reading and hearing some folk on what's called restorative justice. And I want to just give you one story that I heard. Little young black boy, I forget about 8 or 10, throws a pencil at the teacher, gets disciplined. He goes out to find out what the discipline is going to be. Instead, he sends to this person who's working in a project of restorative justice, and And so then when she sent to that person, the person doesn't ask, what did you do? You were a bad boy. He says, what's going on in your life? Tell me about what's going on. And he says, and he starts talking. He says, well, we're having problems at home. My dad is beating up my wife, and I don't think that's very good. And, when I go to school, I noticed the other day there was some blood spattered on a wall. I didn't think that was very good, so I cleaned it off. They talk a little bit about that. And finally, the restorative justice person says, you did something you shouldn't have done, didn't you? And he says, yeah, he says, I did. But she realized that in light of his life, throwing a little pencil was nothing compared to other things. And he also had seen people shot in his neighborhood. It was practically nothing. And they said, well, what should we do about that? And they agreed that he should write a letter of apology to the teacher. And she helped him write it because he wasn't that skilled at it. Sent the letter. The teacher accepted the apology and then took him out to pizza. And he says, instead of sending him out of school for a day or two, he was restored in good standing with the teacher, and apparently things have gone well since that time. So there are other ways of dealing with this issue, with these issues that are very, very helpful. Oh, one other thing. I heard another person who studied this nationally. She said that in New Zealand, the Moros, which I think are the local local folk who were there before the Europeans came, had a system of disciplining their youngsters. But their youngsters kept getting taken into juvenile hall in the European system, if you will. Finally, they said, we want to punish our own children. And the government agreed they could punish their own children, and it was all sort of a restorative justice type system. It worked so well that I haven't read that, but she reported that New Zealand has accepted the moral way of disciplining youngsters, and they've done away with the juvenile justice system.
Interesting, fascinating. In California, we've started 22 tribal courts in California so that the tribes can discipline their young people. Question to my right.
Yes, sir. My name is Melissa Netzel. I'm a student here, and I have a question about Charles Manson.
Charles Manson?
Yes. He is obviously the worst criminals in California history, and yet he's still in jail, isn't he? He's a death row for how long?
In Vacaville. I think Quinn Denvers might have visited him once or twice. Go ahead. What's your question?
Well, how does he stay out of death? How does he stay out of death penalty? Why has he not been put to death yet?
Well, at the time he committed his crime, there was that little break in time when there was no death penalty in California. And in fact, I think his crimes were punishable by life with possibility of parole, which is not true now. But he's confined, and they'll never grant him parole because it goes up to a parole authority, and they'll deny it forever. So he'll be in prison for the rest of his life and die there. I think that's right. He may be up at.
Good question. It's just that the law at the time did not provide for the death penalty.
Wow.
Good question.
Thank you.
To my left.
Have a good day.
Hi, my name is Imelda Munoz, and my question is I was wondering if you guys believed that if the glamorization of illegal activity in mainstream media made the disproportion that we see in the prison system any worse, if it exacerbated.
I'm sorry, say it slower and into the mic, the last part.
I'm sorry.
That's okay, take your time.
If the mainstream media played any part in further exacerbating the disproportion that we see in the prison system.
Yes, thank you. That's another good question. Who wants to field that one about the impact of the media on this rates of incarceration?
I'm not an expert on this one particular media, but my students have written a lot about this topic. It's something, so I my race and juvenile justice course, what topic is look at the role of media or popular culture, and they always gravitate to looking at films and the way they represent. But they're really savvy in looking at these films. I didn't see the film, I think it was called Gran Torino with, it talks, there's a Hmong, I think, is it a Hmong character? And then, so my student was talking about the main character who was, what's his name? Clint Eastwood. And the way in which Clint Eastwood represents a particular kind of, it comes out to be a hero, I guess, in the movie. I didn't see it, but my student was saying it was very problematic the way, but it was kind of in the end, he's killed, and it's representative, not because of tragic here, but it's representative of a way that kind of, you know, it's that environment, how things get settled, I don't know. But I think that young people are in tune to them, and they do play a large role. And I think that's part of the things that we're saying, like, how can we put our finger on where these decisions are made? That's one aspect of it. People's perceptions, and, you know, people always debate, like, did the media make them do it? Well, there's a big debate on that, too. You know, listening to rap music, does that lead? All that is debate. People debate that.
Paul, you had a comment?
There's a book called The New Jim Crow by a woman named Michelle Alexander, and she goes to great lengths to show how the war on drugs was aimed at black people and how it was a combination of politicians and the media that did this. And I would commend that book to your reading if you really want to explore this.
That was
The
exactly
New
what I
Jim
was
Crow
what I was
by
wondering.
Michelle Alexander.
Mr.
Also-
Munoz,
yeah.
there's a whole school of thought that the media has desensitized violence and glorified drug and narcotic intake. So I'm sure none of us are experts per se on that, but there's no doubt an influence in my view.
The other big one was the super predator of the 1990s, and this idea of the wildings and the youth prey, and we're gonna.
And all the video games. I just heard on the radio a mother or grandmother complaining that her children or grandchildren love these video games, and she said the gorier they get, the more they like them, she said, and they play them for hours and hours. So it's a multiple battering of young people by violence, and I don't know, I think it must affect somebody.
I know that Paul is in the trial courts and has had hundreds of cases. Tim is a trial lawyer. I, as a judge, have had hundreds of cases in front of me where people shoot each other, stab each other, young people, and don't seem to have much of an emotional attachment to the harm and the violence that they've committed. And I can't help but think that some of it has to do with what you asked about, media. On to my right.
Okay, my name's Antonio, and I'm a student here. The Latino population is constantly growing. It's one of the fastest growing race in America. And recently, you know, the United States, a lot of states have passed anti-immigration laws like Arizona's SB 1070 and whatnot. Why is it that with a lot of students, younger population going to school, how come authorities still target Latinos when they have been progressively getting better, I would say? And, you know, they're no longer like gang affiliated. There's always going to be gangs and everything. But why do they get targeted more than any other race?
And I think maybe Justice Reynoso, with his investigation of the campus, it's sensitization of police departments probably in large part, but Justice Reynoso?
Yeah. And it's also how successful they can be. And it has to do with the discretion that the police have. For example, I've been the chair of a private civil rights commission studying the shooting death of a young farm worker in Woodland, California. He had immigrated to this country about 10 years ago. The record indicates that he was stopped by the police nearly 20 times in those 10 years, one time for riding a bicycle on the wrong side of the street. Well, they get stopped, one, because the Latino community still doesn't have the same political power that other groups have, and two, they stop to then ask them questions. And then they very often they ask to search the person. The person doesn't know that they can say no, so they say, yes, you can search me. They'll obviously will find more people that have violated a law. Actually, they never did on him, but it's the discretion that the police have and the contact that folk have in the different communities, and it's a lot. The police, I think, intuitively know that they are less likely to get into trouble if they stop Latinos and blacks than if they stop an Anglo whose father may be the police chief, you know. So I think it's their way of just getting a good record on arrests, if you will, without much political problem.
Professor, do you have a comment?
I was just going to say, keep mentioning my colleagues, but Kevin Johnson, who's the dean of law school at UC Davis, he writes about his writings are all about how Mexicans and Latinos have come to symbolize illegality. I mean, it's sort of it's conflated in these days in many places, especially in some places like Arizona. But in California, I think it's our numbers that are keeping us from going there. But I think that's what's happened.
Thank you for your question.
So you think it's
I'm
an
sorry.
intimidation factor then
The-
in California, since the numbers are growing?
I think in terms of the electorate, people who can vote.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. To my left?
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Holt. I'm a student here.
Yes,
So
sir.
my question comes from experience I had recently talking to a friend of mine. He's 25 now. He was involved in his first drive-by shooting when he was 10. Growing up in Fresno, a young Hispanic American, he's Mexican. His whole neighborhood's like that. The other interesting things he brought up, though, are that he and all his neighbors have been on public assistance their entire lives. Their parents didn't work. They've been receiving handouts from us their entire lives. So maybe they aren't growing up with a sense of responsibility. So right now, we're trying to attack the problem of the death penalty, but not the problem of people growing up with no sense of responsibility and then going and committing these crimes. So maybe, I guess my question is, are our efforts better spent trying to put a pail out and try to catch rainwater dripping through the roof or fix the roof? Is it better for us to stop the death penalty and not address disparities in race or anything else in people getting arrested and put on death row? Or is our money better spent trying to help these communities and get them to stop committing crimes as well? I'm not saying that I know crimes are committed, appropriately. I'm not trying to say that I'm a racist and the rest. But is our money better spent helping the communities get out or to end the death penalty?
Yeah.
Somebody on my left or to Justice
Sure.
Reynoso?
I
Clearly,
would say that we would be better off for a young person living in a ghetto or a barrio where there's no hope. We'd be better off as a society if we offered them voluntarily to go to a boarding school somewhere, and maybe we'd spend $30,000 a year. We'd be better off doing that than to keep that person locked up for the rest of their life. We can make that person a productive person, whereas if they go to prison, they're just a drain on everybody.
Justice
And I think
Reynoso?
we need a total realignment of our priorities.
let me give you a couple of statistics. The mayor of Sacramento is urging the schools there to make sure that all the children in the 3rd grade read at the 3rd grade level. And he says that the statistics show that 90% of those in prison did not read at the 3rd grade level. I think that's just a different statistic than I've read, which is the following. 90% of those in prison never graduated from high school. That is, they start falling behind. So how much better would it be to put the resources to make sure that those kids continue to do well in grammar school, so they do well in high school, so they graduate from high school and they don't go to prison? Clearly that would be better. One of the sad things to me is that in terms of how folk respond, it's so much easier to pass a law saying, by golly, you do something, we'll put you in prison, instead of really worrying about how the folk got there. So my quick answer to you is, clearly it's better for society to put the resources up front, but somehow without the electorate being educated to that, it won't happen. Let me just again tell you one little story. A judge from Orange County told me the following. The state of Washington asked for a grant from the federal government. They got it. They were going to do just 2 very simple experiments. One, they were going to put people getting out of prison on unemployment insurance for 6 months, 50%. 50% were getting nothing other than a couple of $100, whatever they get, enough bus money to get home. That's all they did. Then they did a study later on, and they studied the recidivism rate. And they found, not surprisingly, that the recidivism rate was far higher for those who were not on unemployment insurance, which makes sense. Those that were on unemployment insurance had enough resources to get reintegrated into their families and find a job and all that. Then they did one other study. Was it cheaper to rearrest those who were recidivists, or was it cheaper to put people on unemployment insurance for 6 months? It was clearly cheaper to put folk on unemployment for 6 months. And besides, the crime rate had gone down, right? So I said, what did the state of Washington do with that? He said, nothing. I said, what? How come? Here you had something that was going to cut down crime and have less recidivism and save money. And he says, no, the politicians were afraid that they would be accused of being soft on crime. So that emphasizes how important it is for us as citizens to know what's going on and say, hey, wait a minute, let's put that money into K through 12. Let's put that money into helping the mentally disabled, et cetera, rather than waiting years and put them in prison.
Thank you. That was a very good question. Thank you, sir.